Okay, so this is part 2 of basic jQuery. The first part was very, very basic jQuery. This is part 2. This is very basic jQuery. And sometime in 2021, we'll do basic jQuery, which will be part 3. And we're recording this so that if you aren't able to, if you aren't able to be here right now, you can watch it later. Or if you are here now and you have questions or you want to watch it again, it'll be archived. It'll be on our website at koha-US.org. And this is a little, you know, for very basic jQuery, I'm seeing a lot of people here that I know are beyond basic jQuery. I only see 3 people that I'm confident might need some help. And so that's a little daunting because I'm sure that I'm going to explain something that somebody, some of these fine people that are here are going to say, well, I could have explained that better. So, so that's a little daunting, but I'm going to put a link in the chat box and then I'm going to start sharing my screen. And the link that I put in the chat box is to my notes from this, for this, that so you should be seeing a screen that says very basic jQuery, or are you seeing one that looks like YouTube?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. So this is the site that I created for these 3 or more webinars, and it's the first presentation is all here. Very, very basic jQuery. And the video, there's a link to that there. So if you, the actual URL is basicjquery.hopperdietzel.org. That's HOPPERDIETZEL.org. And if you click on that link, it'll take you to the notes that I had for the first presentation. If you click on the link for the video, it will, of course, take you to YouTube. And I've got this up here that I was going to introduce myself. So I'm George Williams. For the 2 of you that are here that might not know me, I'm the Next Search Catalog Coordinator at Northeast Kansas Library System. And a lot of people in the Koha community think NECLS equals the shared catalog that we operate, but NECLS actually provides a lot of different services. We have 117 member libraries, but only 51 of them are members of the shared catalog. And I'm the only employee, out of 10 employees at NECLS, I'm the only one whose full-time job is 100% devoted to the shared catalog at Koha. And we've been using community Koha since, or we've been using Koha since 2008. We've been on community Koha since 2011. And before I was here in Kansas, I was in Idaho. And you know, I was just talking about my past with some of my coworkers. We were talking about some different stuff. And there is nothing more important to my library career in the beginning than the fact that I used to be a bus driver. Because having a commercial driver's license is what got me my first full-time job at a library, which was as the bookmobile driver for the Police Public. And you can find all this information at the very bottom of the page where it says About George. If any of you want to get in touch with me, just go to the last slide in that batch of slides, and you'll be able to get in touch with me. Although many of you I already know, so I should be able to get, you should be able to get in touch with me without any problems. So I'm going to jump in here to very basic jQuery. And to recap, for those of you that weren't here, that haven't seen the first presentation, jQuery is a JavaScript library. Christopher asked the question, how do you spell jQuery? I went over that in the first presentation. So if you weren't here for that, you can watch the video and review how to spell jQuery. And basically, jQuery is a JavaScript library, and it's useful for Koha because there are 4 system preferences in Koha that allow you to add jQuery to Koha. And the benefit of that is you can do some things using jQuery that would prevent you from having to go through the process of writing a whole development to get something in Koha changed. That's not to say you might not want to get something changed in Koha, but this first example that I'm going to give you, it kind of covers why sometimes doing a whole development isn't necessary, or it isn't even desired. And another thing that I'll mention is that there is a jQuery library, and there's a link on the page for that. There are hundreds of pieces of jQuery that people have already written. There's 151 just related to the staff client, and then there's another at least 100 for the OPAC. And so if you go to that site, there is some value to just going there and picking up something and grabbing it and sticking it on your system, and it might do exactly what you need it to do. One of the things that I find a lot, like if we just click on one of these, we'll probably find 1 or 2 if we scroll through. Add focus to cataloging search. This one says version Koha 3.0. I was looking earlier today. Here's one from Koha 3.4. The wiki, the jQuery library on the wiki is kind of like a bulletin board at the grocery store that people put up notices about cars for sale and lost cats. And the thing about it, if you go to Safeway, there's usually a note up there that says the bulletin board is cleared on the 1st of every month. This bulletin board has never been cleared. There's a lot of stuff here, don't allow checkout overrides. Version 3.4. Version 3.4 has got to be like 2010, maybe 2009. So there's a lot of these here that might not actually work if you put them on your system right now. But that doesn't mean that they're not valuable, and that you can go in here and look and see what somebody else has done and maybe try to figure out how to adapt it to make it work in your system currently. And so I talked about some basics of Koha. You know what? I'm going to mute my phone really quickly to keep that from ringing again. There we go. And so I talked about some of the basics of Koha and some of the stuff that I'll just recap really quickly. And then I talked about the very first piece of jQuery that I learned, and there's a couple of things that I can show you about this that'll explain why sometimes a development isn't necessary or desired, and just the basics of how to get in there and do something to kind of get us on track for doing some stuff today. So my first training with Koha, there's a whole bunch of people in the room, 30 people in the room, and the trainers were teaching everybody how to add a patron to Koha. And let me actually go first. So I'm at the administration module, which you can get to from the home page in Koha. You click on the link that says Koha administration. And if you don't see this link, it means that you don't have permission to do any of the stuff that we're doing. So that's something, if you don't see the administration link, you might want to talk to your system administrator and see if you can get permission to edit the system preferences in Koha, which will give you the ability to add this stuff to your system. So let me go in here. This is one of the system preferences for adding jQuery and JavaScript to your system is Internet User JS. And I was testing all of these things, making sure they worked for the training. yesterday, and it looks like I forgot to take them out. So let's start with a blank slate. We got nothing in here. And so let me get back to my story. There's 30 people in the room. We're all learning how to use Koha. Ed and Nicole from Bywater Solutions are there, and they're teaching us how to enter patron data. And one of the fields that comes up is surname. And so, of course, somebody in the room asked the question, what's a surname? So surname, rather than going to the effort of trying to teach everybody who didn't know what a surname was, that it means, you know, your last name or a person's last name. What I wanted to do was just to change the text from surname to last name. My experience is that if you've got one person that asks a question, like what's a surname, what's really going on is that there are probably 10 people that have the same question that just they're too afraid of looking dumb to ask the question. So I figured if one person is asking what's a surname, it means there's probably 10 people in the room that don't know what it is. And rather than try to train up their vocabulary to recognize what a surname is, I figured it's simpler to use plain language in the catalog in Koha. And so what I wanted to do was change surname to last name. And so if you've already looked at the last presentation, what we need is to put some jQuery into Internet User.js. And we're going to start with just the basics, which is all jQuery starts with a $, ends with a semicolon, and there's going to be a selector in parentheses in quotes. That's the first part of a jQuery statement, and then there's going to be an action after that. So first you select something on the page, and then you tie an action to that selector. And in the first part, I also discussed that the way that you can find out what the code is underneath these is to type Control-Shift-I, and then we can do Control-Shift-C and point at things on the page, and then look down here, and we can see that this is this thing is a label. Surname is a label. It's got a class, which is something that we could use as a selector if it's unique enough. And then we've got an attribute. The attribute is for, and the value of that attribute is surname. And then we've actually got the text of the label and then the end of the label tag. So, like I said, it's got a class here. The class is required. And in the first part of this, I told everybody that the way you select with the class is you can do just .required. And then what we want to do is we want to do an action. So we're going to do text. And the action is usually going to be a word, a dot followed by a word, followed by parentheses, and there might be something in that parentheses. So the action that we're going to do here is we're going to do .text, which is going to take whatever text we put in these quotes inside this parentheses, and it's going to replace the text that's here, which is the word surname, with whatever text we put in. So if I use a selector like .required, and then use last name, there's going to be a problem because classes can repeat throughout a page. And so everything that has the class required, which includes the last name, we've replaced the text that says required. If we scroll down here, we'll also find that we've renamed card number last name. We've renamed home library last name, and we've renamed patron category last name because those are all required. They all have the same class. So in this case, the class isn't going to help us. So what we want to do is look at this thing again, and we can tell that it's a label and it's got an attribute. So we'll take this required out of here, and we're going to say label for an equal sign here. And you have to spell everything absolutely correctly. So instead of selecting class required, we're going to select class where the label has the attribute for, and the value of that attribute is surname. And then when we reload the page, that's the only thing that's going to be changed. Card number, library, and category all stay the same. And I would even take this a step further, and I did take it a step further in the example that I wrote. I think I didn't, but we can add this. If we add another selector in their entry form, then it's only going to change this label when it's on the entry form. So if the label for surname shows up in other places, which it might, this will prevent that from changing there. It's only going to change it when it's on this form here in the patron add and modify sections is there. So let me stop and see if anybody has any questions. And feel free to turn on your mic. You can type things in the chat box. Tell me if I'm going too fast, going too slow. Questions are welcome. So. Christopher Brannon is saying, element IDs are the best to use. Classes are okay if you're targeting everything with that class, like a grouping. And yes, he's right. The more specific you can be in the selector, the less likely you are for the things that you're modifying with jQuery to do crazy stuff. And each page, the body of each page in Koha, like the body of this page has an ID, patron, member, entry, GEN. So I don't know what the GEN stands for, but it's patron, member, entry. If you start with the body ID, if you only want to affect a specific pages, adding that, being as specific as possible helps a lot because it prevents the jQuery from affecting everything. If you were to do something, virtually every page in Koha has a button on it somewhere. And most of the buttons have a class of BTN. And so if you tell Koha to do something to button, it's going to change the name of every button on every page everywhere in Koha. So if you want to change the name of a button and it doesn't have a specific ID or a specific class, you've got to add a ton of information to make sure that you're just getting the button that you want. Fortunately, most of the buttons have an ID in them now, I believe. So I think Jan is general, could be different pages for, I imagine there are different IDs for different sections of the page, yes. So that was the first piece of jQuery that I learned, and it's a really simple thing. The first presentation, we got as far as showing how to hide and remove things, which is useful in and of itself, but being able to change the text on the page is useful too. And the reason that I think this one is a good example of why making some of these changes with jQuery as opposed to asking for a complete system-wide change to Koha everywhere is because what I can envision if somebody were to put a bug into Bugzilla in the Koha community and say, hey, shouldn't we change surname to last name? I would imagine there are some libraries that are going to say, why do we need to do that? Why is that important? They're going to, there's going to be a debate over the value of spending time on that. Sometimes when these kinds of things get debated, the amount of energy spent on arguing over whether or not a change should be done is probably more energy than it would be expended in actually making that change. But this was a quick way, back then 8.5 years ago, that I could go in and change surname to first name. Let me reload that. Without having to go through the development process, without having to go outside of my own library. It's not anything that we had with the previous system we were using. And then as soon as we did that, I also did this next one, which our old system had a separate field for a patron's middle name. Since that wasn't available in Koha, we just changed the label on first name to first name plus middle name, because that was something we asked for people to enter when they created a library card, was to either get a middle initial or a full middle name, because we were dealing with lots of patrons and lots of patrons that had the same names. And then we changed other name to nickname / other name. So one of the questions that people that are new to this are probably asking is, how do I remember what the selectors are? And so there's a link on that page that I put on there to W3 School's Jquery page. And this is a very useful thing, particularly for beginners. There's also jquery.com is the official page for the Jquery API, and it goes through every single command and function and part of the Jquery library. I find the thing that I like about the W3 Schools organization is that if I can't remember how to select something, on the left-hand column, there's a table of contents that I can just go to selectors and click on that and open this up in a new window. And it goes through all of the different ways you can write a selector to pick out an element on the page. If you want to use the asterisk, that will select everything on a page. So if you really, if you're angry and you quit your job the day before you quit, if you go in and write a piece of jQuery that is, you can hide all the elements on the page and nobody will be able to go in and do anything. Not something I recommend, but if you're really angry at your boss, that's a great tip there. But this will walk you through anything that is an ID starts with a hashtag. Anything that you're selecting as a class starts with a dot. Christopher says, don't code in anger. If you have two selectors that you want to do the exact same thing, you can separate them, put them in the same parentheses, separated by a comma, and it will select both of those. That I do a lot. But all of these different things are different ways to select the things on the page, and this is how I keep track of them. Particularly when you're dealing with attributes, sometimes I'll want to do attribute begins with, which I can never remember. It's the caret equal sign and then the value. Or I want to do something that ends with a value. That's the $ equals followed by the text that you're trying to select. And then there's also a list here of the events, blur, change, click, and the jQuery effects. Hide, show are the ones that I think I use the most. Fade in, fade out. And then how to use jQuery to manipulate HTML elements and CSS elements. Like if you want to add a patron or add an attribute to a HTML element, there's a way to do that. You can add classes, you can remove classes, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff. And so, you know, I don't remember all of these. I remember a lot of them, but I don't remember all of them. And that's why, you know, I usually go to here, or like I said, the jQuery, jquery.com, which goes through all of them, and it will even list some of these, I believe, are depreciated. There's a way to see a list of which ones are being phased out. It's over here on the left. You know, each version of jQuery that comes along, the library keeps getting updated and things are added and removed. And that's the way to keep track of what's being removed. So far, you know, this is about how to hide things, how to change labels. The next basic thing that I learned was how to use jQuery to manipulate the data that's being, not just the data that's being presented, but how to manipulate the data that's being input. So one of the things that I learned early on was, let's say we want to take this last name, and let's say every patron in your system, and this is true where I used to work, their last name is their password, and their username is their card number. So normally, if you're entering a patron, you put in like Smith, Joe, and if you get down here and you enter the card number, when you get to username, password, and confirm password, you need to retype all of that stuff. So this was one of the next things that we wanted to work on. And we can do this with jQuery. We can take the data from last name and use it to pre-fill the password. And we can take the data from the card number and use it to pre-fill the username. And this requires something that's more advanced than anything we've talked about so far in this session or the first session. But first, I want to walk through the steps of how to figure out how to do this. So the first thing we're going to need to know is what's a way to select this password input. So if I go to the inspector and click on it, I can see that it has an input ID of password. So once again, $ and semicolon, parentheses, quotes. And like I said before, if the password field is going to show, if there's something with an ID of password on more than one page, it's not a bad idea to go up here and know that we want to do this just on the entry form, so we can add the ID to the entry form here too. So this selector is looking for anything with an ID of password, but it's only looking for it when it's underneath, when it's nested inside of something that has this ID. And one of the things that you can find somewhere in here in the CSS and HTML methods, there's an action called VAL. It sets the value. And the way we're going to use it, it's going to set a value here. So if we do VAL value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if we save that, then every time we reload this page, it's going to pre-fill the password value with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And actually, password is a bad one to learn this on because the value of a password is always hidden from the page. But what we've got here is we've just told jQuery that wherever we see this thing with the ID of password on inside of anything where the ID is patron member entry, change the value of that field to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in this case, we also have another box underneath it called password 2. So what we can do, like I said earlier, we can put these two together. This is the password field. This is the second password field. And if we put those together as a selector and separate them with a comma, when we reload this and scroll back down here, we've got the password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in both the password and the confirm password box. That in and of itself isn't very useful, but it gives us a starting point. Because what we can do now is we can set this aside for a minute. And so what we want to do is we want to now create a function. So we know how to put data into these two fields. I've just demonstrated that we can do that. Now I'm going to look at the last name field, which is up here. And even though we've changed the label, the name of the ID of the field is still surname. So now what we want to do is start again. And I'm getting ahead of myself here possibly. What I did, I want to keep this around so I can read it and know what I'm working with here. Anything that starts, any line that starts with 2 slashes like this, 2 forward slashes, is a comment in jQuery. So this will be ignored by the JavaScript program. So it's not going to run this code because the 2 slashes indicate that it's not code, it's comment. And I'm just doing that so that I've got it handy here when I need it in just a minute or two. So we've got, we want to grab, the selector we want to use is surname. And what we want to do here is we can select that and then we can add a function to it. In this case, what we're doing is an event, I believe. And we're going to use this one called blur. So right there, somebody, I hope, I imagine, is asking the question, what's blur? Blur is the opposite of focus. And now somebody, I hope the same person, is asking the question, okay, what's focus? Focus is when you put the cursor into something. So if we're, particularly with input fields, focus means put the cursors in that box, and blur is when you take the cursor out of that box. So here I'm focused into the surname field, and here I've left the surname field, so I've blurred that field and I've focused on the first name field. So what I want to do here is blur and in this parentheses we're going to create a function, and function is followed by 2 curly brackets. And so what we've done here is we've selected the surname field, and the action we're tying to it is when the surname field is blurred, the function is going to run some other code. And so what's the other code that it's going to run? We're going to have it do something to the password field. And so what we want it to do to the password field is we're going to take the data from this same selector So we're going to take the value of patron surname, and we're going to, when we leave that cursor out of the surname box, we're going to take the value of that surname field and put it into these other 2 fields. And Christopher is reminding me that this is supposed to have a semicolon at the end. So let me reload this page, and then we can watch this happen. So Smith, Joe, and then when we take the cursor out of that field, if we go down here, well, this is the fun part, is when you try to figure out why something didn't work. Blur function. Let's go to the cheat sheet. Entry form surname. Oh. Well, that should have worked. Oh, I forgot the, Christopher's pointing out that I forgot the parentheses after the function. That's what I did wrong. So let's go back to that original one, because it should work. Let's put those in there. Then we'll try it again. There we go. And then we can do the same for card number. That's going to be it's going to have a similar I know that the card number, library card number has an ID of card number. So if we put that there and that there, and I know that the user ID, the username has the user ID card number. selector ID. Now if we reload, we do Smith. And we do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as the card number. You can actually see it pop up there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As soon as we click out of this input box, the card number pops up down here as the username. So this is where jQuery starts to get really useful, is not only can you change the appearance of things on the screen, but we're also able to make Koha start to do things that can be helpful, like pre-populating fields or doing other things like that. And I'm going to stop here for a second and ask if anybody has any questions. And see you later, Ed. Thanks for coming. So does anybody else have any questions? Anybody else want to say something? All right. So in the website, I talk about, what's a function. We got blur, we've got focus. Here's an example of how you can use blur and focus, or at least focus. Does blur, Christopher actually has a question. Does blur work if you just hit save without moving off the field? And actually, I don't think so, because when you hit save, another action takes place. So I think you actually, in order to get the blur to work, you actually have to click out of the field, which if you're entering patron information, you're clicking in and out of fields all the time. So it's usually not an issue. I do have some jQuery that's a little more advanced that I've tied to some buttons, particularly when you're paying a patron fine or writing off a patron fine. When you click on the button to do the write-off, I've got some jQuery that appends a note into the note field of whatever it is you're writing off. And so there I didn't use blur specifically because it won't work if you hit the button, but if you tie the action to a button that already exists, then you get this, then you can get it that way. In the case of this particular thing, changing the password when you blur, I think that makes sense to do that there. But there are other places where you want to tie it to a button if you're expecting staff to push a button after they finish filling out a field. What I was going to show was the opposite of blur is focus, and we don't have focus in the koha-US demo site yet. So let me do a search for, search the catalog, and I'm just going to do a search for the letter A, because I know the 2 bibliographic records we have in our demo site both have an A in them. What you'll notice here is that when you do that search, if you go to type something else, if you go to do anything else, the cursor doesn't, after you complete a search, it doesn't move into the search box up here. But if we put in this string of jQuery, which catalog results search form, and save that. So this is the catalog results page. When you whenever it loads, if you load that jQuery, it will always put the cursor up here in the search box, so you don't have to always go up there and click on it when you want to do another search after you've done one search. I think that might be a jQuery that Christopher wrote, 8 years ago, but that I think a lot of people use. In any event, I stole it from him. And that's exactly what that jQuery library is for, is to go out and steal things from other people. And Lizette says harvested. Yes, harvest is another, it's a euphemism for steal. And I'm not big on euphemisms, so I'll just call it stealing. So I actually wanted to go out to the koha-US OPAC. All of the stuff that I've done so far has been related to the staff client. But this is something, that I can show you that at the koha-US KohaCon in joint koha-US KohaCon in Portland, some people were there from Dubuque, Iowa, and they had just started using Koha. And one of the things they noticed is that they had a location that was hidden, and all of the items in the location were hidden, but the location itself would show up in the search facets on the OPAC whenever anybody did a search for anything where there was a result in there. And so this is the preference that we've been in this whole time, is intranet user JS. And so I'm going to make sure that's all saved. And then we'll go over to OPAC. OPAC user JS. And I will put this in here. So Dubuque had an issue where they had a location that was appearing in the facets that they wanted the items there to be hidden, and then they wanted to remove the location as well. And that's one thing that Koha doesn't do well, is if you hide a location, or if you hide an item type, the facets, it still builds the facets based on those, and it still shows those facets. So this little piece of jQuery will actually hide it should hide that facet for book, but it didn't. So let's figure out why it didn't hide that. Facet label A, title, book, parent, hide. Oh, it's because I'm not in the OPAC. I'm in the staff client. But it doesn't work in the staff, it doesn't work in the OPAC either, apparently. So what did I do wrong? There it goes. It just needed to reload properly. And I'm getting applause. Thank you for the applause. I appreciate that. So what this is doing is it's looking for anything with a class of facet label with an anchor that has an attribute of title equals book. And this is something that I haven't shown yet either. It's what if the thing that we want to select so I'm going to go up here to where item types are. Like I said in the first presentation, there's a difference between hide and remove. So all that hide does is it makes it so that it's invisible on the final page. But the code is still there. And so if we look at this, this is what that actual thing that's being hidden is. And without that jQuery, the style here would say style display block. And so by the hide command just tells it to change that style to display none. And so what this does is it's looking for anything, an anchor with the title equals book. And so we've got that. We've got an anchor where title equals book. But if we just hide that facet label, it leaves a space. It leaves a big space here. So let me take this parent part out and reload. So what I found when I wrote this and tested it is if we select this and hide it, it just hides the anchor. And if you've got a long list of things, there'll be a space there. Like if we had it up here, if we were hiding Frederick Brown, we would see this gap here. And so we don't want to hide, we don't just want to hide the anchor, we want to hide the thing that it's inside of. And so we're selecting this, but then we can use a command called parent. And so what it's going to do is it's going to say, find this thing, and then go to the thing that's above it, the parent. And then that's the thing that we want to hide. So if we reload this again, you can see that, we've got, here's the anchor, and it's inside of a span called facet label. And if we reload this, so here's the anchor, and we haven't hidden the anchor. We haven't hidden just the anchor. We've actually hidden the whole span that it's inside of. So that's a good command to know if you're trying to, if you're having difficulty pinpointing with a selector what it is that you're trying to select. If you can find something to select that's inside of it, then you can hide the whole parent. And actually, I think we could change this to parents. And I think if we do that, it'll hide all of the parents, which includes the entire page. So that's a good one not to do. And this is one of the reasons too, I should add this that I haven't really talked about. Usually when I'm doing this kind of work, I open up my jQuery system preference in one window, and then I do all my testing in a separate window, so that if I accidentally hide everything on the page, I can actually go in and just delete that and save it, and then go back and reload the work in the other window. I always prepare what I think is not enough for a whole hour, and then it turns out that it's been almost a whole hour. So maybe I should stop here and ask if there are any more questions. And then the things that I haven't covered today can be folded up into basic jQuery, which, like I said, will be sometime next year. So does anybody have any questions? Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen and see if other people will turn on their microphones or maybe their video and ask questions or whatnot. When is hide better than remove? I tend to use hide for some things where in the staff client where I've got them hidden from everybody. And then that way, if I want to go in and access them, I still can't because I know how to get in there and see where they are. Does that make sense? And there are a couple of other things, you know, in our system. Let me flip over to next. I have all this fancy jQuery for my circulation rules. I have a bunch of columns in the circulation rules that are collapsed. And so these things are pre-hidden with a hide command before I load the page. If I used remove to collapse these columns or to hide the data in the columns, then I wouldn't be able to show it if I wanted to show it. So does that make sense, Christopher? And do I test with the console log at all? Yeah, I use the console log. Yes, hide is good for things that you might want to bring back. That's a good way to explain it. Michael says, question on parent. Can you .parent. Is that a thing? Yes. And in the information, well, actually with children, you can specify, I want the nth child. And Christopher's right, you need to put parent, each of those parents has to have an empty parentheses behind them. Selectors. With children, you can specify like the first child, the last child, or child number n. And it seems to me that there may be a way to do that with parent, but it's not something that I tend to do very often, so I'm not 100% sure of how to do it. But it seems to me there is a way to say the fifth parent of this element. But off the top of my head, I don't remember how to do that, but I believe there is a way to do that, Michael. And Jason says something with an nth, maybe. It might be. And then there's this parents until. But that's something that I don't use very often, so I don't remember for sure how to do that. Are there any other questions? Well, I think that's it for this basic jQuery. Hopefully this is helpful to the couple of you that came that don't already know more than I do.
All right. Thanks, George. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.
All right.